There are plenty of ancient gods dedicated to fermentation. In the Baltics, there's Ragutin and Ragupatis, who are the gods of fermentation and of beer, respectively. They're partners. In Mexico, you have Microbal, who is the goddess of pulque, Bacchus and Dionysus, Roman and Greek, respectively, gods of wine. Silenus was a companion and tutor to the wine god, Dionysus. Varuni, the Hindu god of wine. Bamweje was the West African Hausa spirit of drunkenness. And the list goes on and on and on. There's actually a Wikipedia article dedicated to this, and it's like 50 lines long. And those are just known examples. But the point is that alcohol, out of any form of fermentation, is usually the easiest one to kind of self-start and the easiest one to isolate. You know, hunter-gatherers may have had lots of ways to interact with the living world. They could, you know, forage for grains, for tubers. They could hunt. They could preserve their kills by burying them in tundra or, you know, permafrost. They could salt them. Ancient Australian Aborigines have great traditions of fermenting in seawater, in little kind of dugout caves underneath the earth. But 11,000 years ago, in kind of what is Eurasia and Africa, that kind of like large chunk of the world, people began to experiment with kind of semi-permanent settles based on agriculture, and that kind of changed the game. The village of Areni in what is now Armenia is home to the world's oldest winery. The caves of Areni are famous in anthropology as being kind of renowned for their ability to have preserved for thousands of years both human remains and archaeological remains. These were cave-dwelling people. They would go in there, that basically make these kind of semi-permanent dwellings. And while it wasn't necessarily a stratified society, this was maybe one of the best and earliest examples in this region, basically the Caucasus Mountains going into Göbekli Tepe, in what's now Turkey, Iran, Armenia. This is kind of the great example of this slow transition to what we consider like the agricultural revolution. It was not a direct kind of de facto overnight, a bunch of people deciding, oh, hey, let's set up camp here and never leave. I've got all these seeds with me. We're going to plant, you know, a field and live our life from there on out. No, it was kind of this like, hey, this place is good for a while. Let's hang out here. Let's go foraging in these vicinities. But hey, I also figured out that, you know, there's this plot of land over there with a lot of this fruit tree, and we can kind of take care of it and make sure that it's going to be here year after year. So there was this kind of constant dabbling with agriculture that happened for thousands of years. We can look back at really, really ancient times and say, oh, no one was farming, you know, 60,000 years ago, as we view farming today. But we should also note that that transition wasn't black and white. It wasn't this kind of binary switch. Just like if you zoom in on the stock market close enough, you can never really discern a trend. It looks completely chaotic. But over, you know, vast swaths of times from, let's say, the 1900s to today, there has definitely been a trend. More wealth has been created in, you know, the public sector. Even if people's individual stocks might go up and down, people might go bankrupt, companies might come in and out of existence. It looks like chaos on the small scale, but it's only over, you know, the vast expanse of history that you can tell that there was this widespread trend. So the first tangible evidence that we have of fermentation anywhere comes from this region in Armenia. It is pottery. It's pottery that has been stained with the remnants of wine that was turned into eventually vinegar. Now, Sandor Katz makes a really good point about this, and it can be kind of discerned from any readings on the subject. If elephant, which have existed on Earth for tens of millions of years, can have a culture dedicated to basically a festival of fermented fruit and its consumption, and baboons and capuchin monkeys can as well, who's to say that humans haven't been doing it for the exact same amount of time, and with our big brains haven't been engaging in it with more fervor, if you will. And like I said, Sandor Katz points out a good, not so obvious point. When anthropologists talk about the first evidence of wine production in the Caucasus Mountains, that date going back to 6500 BC isn't the date that humans started fermenting. It's the date humans figured out how to make pottery. It's the date humans left a tangible record that we could look at today. Because if you're fermenting in a dried out gourd, well, that's gone in a couple of years' time. But if you're fermenting in stone and under the right conditions in, let's say, a deep and dry cave, that will persist when other things won't. But it should also be noted that, that's kind of like the Western history of fermentation. In China, 8,000 years ago as well, there's also evidence of basically their version of beer production. This was made from fermented rice mixed with honey and fruits, and it was based on local cereals that they had available to them. Also dates back to, like the Chinese history of pottery production. As that became available, it was the first time they were able to leave records of these things as well. So while it is great that the Chinese were kind of messing around with grains and mixing them in these kind of hybrid ferments that they would have consumed as alcohol, it should be noted that there is a big difference in between the ability to harvest grains and then store them and transform them deliberately versus like the marula trees in Africa, finding something that's readily available to ferment. And the best source out of any of these is, of course, honey. Honey is the most concentrated sugar source in the natural world. No fruit gets anywhere near it. It's usually by weight, 65 to 75% of three simple sugars. And under the right conditions, let's say that you have a hive bored out into the knot of a tree and you have a heavy storm come through. Under the right conditions, if that honey gets dilute enough, well, it's all of a sudden dilute enough for microbes to take hold. Honey is full of yeast and bacteria, but they're in stasis. Honey is naturally antiseptic because it is so sweetly concentrated, and because of the hygroscopic nature of sugars at such concentrations, it'll pull water away from any other source, which lowers what's called the water activity for microbes to a point where they can't thrive. They might be kind of frozen in stasis. They might go into like spore mode. They can't live in environments like that. So under sufficient dilution, you can have spontaneous fermentation. You can kickstart these microbes into existence, just like an oasis rain in a desert, but this time in a food source, and not only harvest the honey for, the delicious rare food source that it is, as ancient honey hunters did, 8,000-10,000 years ago. You start to kind of get drunk on the matter too, which is fascinating in itself. But the transition, from these kind of like instances of either happenstance where, these ancient humans could gather natural ferments in the wild, or these kind of proto-agricultural communities where these loose bands might come together at certain parts of the year, where they might primarily be fishers or foragers, but have some small amount of, vines or fruit trees available to them for these kind of special occasion ferments. Over time, eventually there was this mass effect reached. You see this, and its best example in the Indus Valley, in the early Indus Valley civilizations in south of Pakistan, I believe. And that was fascinating because you had these large and stratified communities that were centered around floodplain agriculture, the same that you would find eventually, if not almost concurrently, in the Nile Delta as well. And floodplains are amazing places for humanity to set up because they kind of collect and concentrate all of the decayed nutrients during the rainy season and deposit them in very shallow waters in advance of the next dry season for whatever communities happen to be living there. And it's very easy to start up agriculture in these vicinities because you basically have this natural irrigation system with the most fertile soil on earth. So basically, the point is that you can support huge quantities of people on a very small swath of land. It's estimated that for traditional hunter-gatherer societies, and don't quote me here, I don't have the figure in front of me right now, but I think it's something like to sustain someone like the Kalahari Bushmen of Southern Africa. I think they need something like 10 square kilometers per capita of like roaming range to be able to, hunt their animals, to be able to gather their food. And that's kind of how much space they need. Now, translate that to the density of modern day Calcutta or Manhattan or even Copenhagen, and you find that we are completely dependent on, intensive agriculture outside of our main domains. And that all happens, of course, with modern day farming. But in between those extremes, the very first civilizations to pop up were ones that were situated on these river deltas. They were fantastic at, like I said, being able to irrigate crops, and people quite quickly understood what crops fed them the best. We were naturally attracted to the pulses, to the ancient wheats like emmer and barley that had the biggest grains, that were by no mistake the most protein rich. But an important thing is usually left out of this picture, and that's the fact that grains on their own are not great food sources. You will eventually die of pellagra or anemia or other nutrient deficiencies if you're just eating gruel, but you can survive off bread and beer. There are ancient tablets that date back, to these ancient Babylonian civilizations in the Indus Valley that talk about, indentured slaves that were required to build these castles to whatever warlords happened to be ruling these regions at that time. And their payment was like a daily ration of beer. Now, this is very different beer from the beer that we know today. If I were to go to the fridge and crack a cold one, that's filtered, it's high alcohol. Now, the beer back then was basically like a barley porridge that was lightly fermented over the course of a couple of days. But the alcohol level of just like 2 or 3% was enough to keep lots of microbes out, and people knew that. But not only was it enough to exclude pathogen and purify the water source that they were using, microbes also have the ability to create nutrients where there were no nutrients before. Cows, for example, are 1 or like 500 kilogram, half-ton walking hunks of meat that if you hunt them or if you farm them, you can survive off them for a lifetime, as many people have. But all cows eat is grass, and grass is notoriously nutrient deficient. So how then do cows turn grass into their bodies? Well, they don't. Their microbes do. Cows are walking fermenters. Cows take up grass, they mulch it, they swallow it, they let it fester in an acidic solution to initially break it down, they regurgitate it, they swallow it again. And then when it ends up in their caisson, their fermenting stomach, methanogenic bacteria get to work on it and start degrading, using their own enzymes, the complex cellulose and lignin molecules that plants produce to protect themselves against easy consumption that animals have no ability to consume themselves. And it's only because of the microbes that cows carry in them that feast off of all of the cellulose, that transform the cellulose into all of the amino acids of their own bacterial cells, that cows can consume the bacteria and build their bodies. So cows, let's say, aren't so much herbivores as they are bacteriivores. And the same is true for horses, and the same is true for termites, and the same is true for humans. We would never have been able to build complex societies or extracted the amount or extracted the density of energy available to us through agriculture if we had not had microbes with us to transform these simple, crops into fermented foods like bread and beer that were not just more nutritious for us, but also had the amazing and remarkable capacity to be both cellerable, and I'm quoting James C. Scott here, divisible, accessible, storable, and of course fermentable. But these amazing crops at their core formed the basis of modern civilizations. Pulses like chickpeas and soybeans in East Asia, sorghum in Africa, maize and beans in Mesoamerica. Everywhere around the world, you saw these kind of not just triumvirates of pulses and grains and people. What's the next level up after a triumvirate where you have 4 parties? But microbes are always central to the story as well. The Mayans, for example, are another great example that I just kind of mentioned. Ancestral maize harvested by the Maya is not the corn that we know today. Teosinte is famously the classic, very small, kind of husky, little innocuous grass that you would walk over if you saw it in a field. But ancient Mayan corn wasn't quite that modern corn that we understand corn on the cob to be today. Domestication and breeding hadn't transformed it into that, and that came with its own kind of boons and pitfalls. But the maize of the Maya had kind of flint-like seeds, rounded and hard shells or seed coats that made them, of course, less edible, but protected the kernel against lots of crop pests. until the cobs matured. The Maya discovered the ingenious discovery, not of fermentation, but of adding lime or potash to the mixture as they cooked the maize to help break down the cellulose layer in the process of what's called nixtamalization. Now, when European settlers came to North America and started eating maize, they all suffered, like, they got rickets and pellagra and had all sorts of these nutrient deficiencies because they weren't nixtamalizing their corn. But beyond nixtamalization, fermentation also makes corn more edible. So the combination, what's called, the three sisters of maize, beans, and squash, this American trinity, has the ability to kind of be a complete diet, and was for the ancient Maya. Beans had the advantage of being able to carry out symbiotic nitrogen fixation into the soil, fixing it from the atmosphere. Squashes of vine sported large leaves that, when grown beneath tall stalks of maize, shaded the ground to protect against overheated or desiccated soils, and also suppressed weeds from being able to prop up. And when you ate all these three things together, you had this complete diet. But the fermentation of the corn into things like chicha or pulque added this extra boon that also kind of sat at the core of Mayan civilization, as fermentation did across lots of different empires. But I've yet to even talk about, like, ancient Egypt, which was founded on the ancient tradition of making, like, aish baladi, which is this ancient Egyptian bread that you can still buy on the streets of Cairo today. Granaries and fermentories were like one and the same. So you had women that were constantly, day and night, grinding grain into fine powder to bake bread, or to ferment into beer. Beer that was, the slaves that built the pyramid were paid in, and that's what they celebrated with. When they managed to move each brick over the top, it was arduous work, of course, but they also celebrated and reveled in it. And I think there have been, like, stories of like inscriptions like, "Yay, like, we finished our work, now we get to rejoice with beer," carved into the ancient pyramids. So Egypt itself, which was like the longest spanning civilization in history, continuously populated empire that humanity's ever built, was founded off of this braid between agriculture and the microbes that transform that agriculture into a consumable and nutrient rich food source that sustained them for, like I said, thousands of years. I'm really fast forwarding through, like, human history here, but enter the expansion of modern societies into Northern Europe, around the Mediterranean, going up into Greece, when the Phoenicians were kind of battling for that area, and then all the way into, like, modern Rome. You saw the same thing. Barley was consumed as bread and beer by slaves and peasants in Athenian armies, and when those armies were on military campaigns. And Romans used barley and wheat for baking, but they didn't consume it in large quantities for alcohol, as they much preferred fermented grapes. There's this famous quote from the Greek historian Thucydides that wrote, the people of the Mediterranean began to emerge from barbarism when they learned to cultivate the olive and the vine. But bread was still always central as kind of this food source, like the panis quadratus, if you will, to Roman and Athenian life. But surely, dealing with grapes, as that tradition from, the Caucasus Mountains spread, with human history, as people migrated, they took grape seeds with them. And there's been amazing genealogical studies of the transmission of Vitis sylvestris, the common wine grape, across Northern Europe, into France, into Rome, all these places. But they loved it for their symposia, which was the ancient Greek tradition of consuming wine and basically philosophizing, tapping into the spirits of the gods that conferred them with these amazing transformative ingredients that were not just obviously healthy for them and, void of pathogens, and they knew that wines were safe to eat, things like that, but also were mind altering and transformative. And maybe that's why there always has been such a connection between, the supernatural and fermentation, because not only is the products of fermented foods, not only are the products of fermentation nutritious, as of course they are, but they also have the ability to, like, change you, to change your thought patterns, to be able to, spur on conversation, ease inhibitions, and act as kind of like the grease of the social enterprise that is humanity. Romans copied the ancient Greeks, as they did in many respects, with what are called Roman convivia, where they kind of did the same thing, but the Romans got a little bit carried away with it. And these convivia, which of course is the root word of conviviality, also kind of in the tail end of the Roman Empire devolved, if you will, into orgies and other kind of more lewd parties. But it should be noted that the degeneration of the Roman Empire was kind of like an ecological crisis of their own making. Grain supply in ancient Italy evolved from abundant local production to the complete destruction of local environments, and soil erosion on a scale that has not been seen in like ancient history, until they were completely dependent on imported grain supplies for the fermentation of these crops into the foods that kept Rome alive. Romans were like completely dependent on wheat from far off colonies, and the expanse of the Roman Empire was driven largely by the need to grow wheat for Rome, as it was dependent on it for its sustenance. The Punic Wars with Carthage were about gaining wheat output of Sicily and North Africa, and other fermentation technologies like fish sauce, which also went on to fuel the Roman war machine as well. But the biggest boon was Julius Caesar's addition of the grain output of Egypt, Gaul, and Spain to the grain supply of Rome. So at the height of the Roman Empire, its borders expanded to encompass all available land suitable for the production of wheat primarily. And that's what kind of helped to define the borders of the empire itself, was where could they grow wheat to ferment into bread and beer, to feed the army that could then look for more land to grow more wheat that Rome would tax to fuel its consumption of bread and beer, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see how what fermentation was in the early days of like Neolithic human life, this kind of dabbling into, the spiritual, a play farm where you would have a small amount of wild grapes that you would treat as like civiculture, which is like the cared agriculture of wild trees. You would ferment them carefully. And these were things that were done in the homesteads. Over time, this kind of reliant boon on the transformative properties of microbes for increased energy output kind of inverted this like trophic pyramid, these interactions between humans and wild plants, into one of like complete dependency. Eventually, a compounding of climactic events, disease, drought, the plague kind of pushed Rome over the edge, and they were unable to contain control of their wheat empire, and eventually it collapsed. But it's also kind of this prescient retelling of history that, the things that we look to ameliorate or speed up our ways of life, our dependencies, can also be, the linchpin that, should it snap, spells our downfall. So I will skip talking about the British Empire and how the production of grain and the harvesting of sugar for, rum, and the fermentation of tea, and all of this played into the development of the slave trade and the transition into a pre-industrial to a post-industrial world. But rest assured that fermentation has always been central to the development of human civilization. John Ciardi has this famous quote that civilization and fermentation are inseparable. And it is true. It is absolutely true. There is not a culture on earth that does not ferment their food. Our modern world is built on it. 1 out of every 3 calories that you put into your mouth is touched by fermentation in some way, shape, or form. All of the tastiest condiments or anything that you would actually want to eat, be it a cheese or mustard or a hot sauce, anything that adds flavor and spice to your life, enjoyment, wine, bread, any of it, are products of microbes. And that is a testament to the idea of microbial terroir. It's like, yes, plants can be of a place, vanilla trees are the terroir of Madagascar, just as, spruce trees might be the terroir of Canada, where I grew up. But without microbes, we would not have the vanilla bean. Without microbes, we would not have the flavor of pickled spruce tips. And that's kind of the point, is that the players might constantly change, as all ecosystems do. They're constantly shifting. But what microbes bring to the table is far more profound and really truly a mirror to their forms of diversity. It's estimated that there could be as much as 1 trillion microbial species on Earth, which is insane because there's only something like maybe like 16 million species of animals and some like 500,000 species of plants. But that is absolutely dwarfed by the amount of bacterial, fungal, and archaeal diversity. And in some ways, it doesn't even make sense to speak about bacteria as having distinct species because they are so mutable and they are so adaptable and they are so ubiquitous that whenever they do get into our food and manage to not hurt us, we cozy up to them and find their unique voices that echo up through the scales of life. We find their phenotypic effects, the compounds they produce, the enzymes, so enthralling and captivating and mind-altering that we build myths and deities and temples around them. We dedicate the world's first banks and granaries and fermentories and institutions around them. And much of the world's modern economy is still dedicated to them. I mean, just look at it this way. I haven't even gotten to talk about oil yet, and that would take another hour. But all the fossil fuels that make any of this possible, me sitting in my apartment, you looking at me on Zoom, all of the fossil fuels that we mine out of the earth, they're not dinosaur fossils like you saw in cartoons as a kid. No, those are algae. Those are microscopic transformers themselves, harvesters of sunlight that have held on to the energy and compounded it in the belly of the earth over hundreds of millions of years. So again, we also kind of rely on these microbial processes for every aspect of, the world that we know and love.